got me living a good life. Oh, we're putting up a good fight. It's like we're soaking up the sunlight. Oh, and baby, I'm feeling right.
Hello and welcome back to the Scale the Good podcast. Today's podcast is part of Heat Futures at 78 Degrees East, a collaborative project between Good Life X and Lagori Collective, which is supported by the British Council's Climate Futures South Asia program. The project explores how futures thinking, cultural practice, and cross-border collaboration can shape grounded and regenerative responses to heat through multi-sector participation. Today, our Cross City podcast brings together two participants from Bangalore and Colombo who attended the workshops to reflect on their experiences within the project and also from their own personal experiences working on these themes. They will reflect on the growing reality of extreme urban heat and ask what it means to respond differently. So today we'll hear from representing the Bangalore cohort is Anushka Maheshwary, who has a strong background in research and communications and contributed to projects focused on gender equality, LGBTQIA+ rights, mental health, and climate change. And from Colombo, we have Dilina Janadith, a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Integrated Design, who bridges science, technology studies, and social design, examining complex socio-technical issues to support more informed interventions. So very excited to have them both, and I will let both of them take the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Excited to be here today with Dilina. I'm joining from Delhi, and it's a very sunny, hot day in Delhi. What everyone in my office is saying also reflects an early onset of summers, so couldn't be a more important day to talk about this issue of urban heat. And also reflect on, like you said, some of the experiences that we've had as a part of the workshop, also working across parallel contexts of Bangalore and Colombo. Perhaps, Dilna, we can start by reflecting on why heat right now, because we're living in an era where the climate crisis is a sort of redefining moment in many ways. It's redefining how we live. It's redefining how we work. It's redefining how our cultures evolve. And even within that, there's many sort of like areas of there's many mini crises, if we can put it like that. So perhaps we can start with reflecting on why the focus on heat.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me today. Like it was really exciting to be here and share what I think about and what my experiences about the program as well as this very important issue as well. So as Anushka started, yeah, it's if it is started with why it is important to talk about heat. Uh, Recently, I started to expose into this term called planetary health. So, which means from going on individual health to consider what it means to planet level health as an complete cohesive system. So, in those kind of interpretations, like talking about heat as a global phenomena and try to think ourselves as smaller component in there is really important. And I feel like that is what exactly we did with our workshops and whatever we uh, discussed during that few days. And therefore, approaching not simply as heat, but uh, taking different views also important to discuss about how it is related to our life and everything to better, like replan our life to better intervene with the planetary health and our ecosystem. And what are your ideas about this, Anushka?
I think I really like what you mentioned about planetary health and sort of moving away from these individual ideas of how climate change, how heat is affecting us. Because a lot of times, how the conversation is shaped around sustainability, even around climate action, it's a lot of individual action. And so to move beyond that and like also think about like systems level change, particularly in the context of South Asian countries, in the context of the global South, I was reading the latest sort of report by the United Nations IPCC, which identified India specifically as one of the most vulnerable nations to climate change. And this involves heat very majorly. Increasingly, we're sort of seeing more and more headlines about heat waves, heat stress, even in cities like Bangalore, which are traditionally sort of known for their pleasant weather. They're known to be cities where you won't need ACs, you will not need fans because this is a naturally cool city. We're sort of looking at reimaginations of how heat is a big part of how the city moves and sort of like breathes. I also have a personal connection to heat that goes back to, I think, childhood memories where, um, I grew up in northern India. I grew up in Rajasthan, which is known to be a very, very, very hot state. Um, it sort of fits in our traditional understandings of what a hot region looks like. It's a desert area. We grew up with sort of like terms beyond even say like hot and cold that defined heat for us. For instance, during summertime, our moms, our sort of like parents would tell us that don't go outside to play because you'll sort of like the phrase was ki don't go outside to play because loo lag jayegi, which is to signify that it's extremely hot outside. The surface level temperature is really high, so don't go outside to play because you'll your body will store heat, perhaps not sort of exactly conveyed in those scientific sort of vocabularies of body storing heat, surface level temperatures, etc., that we have access to now. But there were already these existing vocabularies of talking about heat beyond the binary of, say, hot and cold. So my connection to heat goes back to that time. But also sort of increasingly realizing that we cannot think of inclusive futures, we cannot think of sustainable futures. And I feel like in the context of the climate crisis and the crisis of heat stress, we cannot think of futures, um, period, without sort of talking about heat. Um, so yeah, I think that's the connection I think that I have to this conversation. And I think it's also sort of interesting then to explore how heat is also mediated by different social realities. It's also not a monolithic phenomena. It's sort of spread across and is differently experienced across regions, across social identities of class, of gender, of caste in the context of India, which also then sort of interact with labor in a major way. So while the sort of public consciousness a lot of times only imagines heat as a climate issue and perhaps increasingly also as a health issue, there are these various sort of intersecting questions that are important for us to explore. And um, perhaps I would love to know like what you think about this, what has come up in your work, particularly in the context of Colombo on some of these questions.
Yeah, like I will start with what you said, like why we as a South Asian countries need to think about it specifically, because when it comes to most of these global level issues, what we often do is like we just borrow and plant the same logic that have been discussed in the North, global North, without contextualizing it, without actually thinking what it means to talk about heat in our own context. So yeah, in that case, like what from my perspective, it's really important is like we need to understand the situation in a contextual manner and properly acknowledging the complexity that, as you said, like how class, caste, all these different intersectionalities deal with the idea of heat. So, for instance, like if you start with a very linear causal explanation, like how heat, the class shapes the way people experience and respond to heat, like we started to notice a lot of different things, the way we perceive, way we behave, Like for instance, I will take a one simple example to discuss what I am trying to say, because it is in a way, even though we start with a linear explanation, it goes in a very vicious cycle. Like for instance, like we see there are small alleyways where people who have smaller house, which less ventilation options, and during very heat and high temperature days, what they normally do is they bring all their activities into the street, like alleyways, keep their chairs, whether housewife are cutting vegetables, talking, even different communities having a chat and everything, all whatever we consider as living room activities brought into the road. So, and the same characteristic that happened because of the heat and everything eventually categorize what it means to be that community, and clinging to that community as their identity as well, which continuously reinforce, like going into a vicious cycle which they cannot get out of it. So in that case, yeah, like that complexity and how it is really linked with heat, their capacity to adapt in different manner, their capacity to negotiate what they should do during work hours, and everything is linked to each other. So that is where I think how I wanted to see this issue, like it's not as a very linear causal one, but we are dealing with a complex network where this heat and poverty and everything play around in a very negative manner to impact our life. So in that sense, like what I was telling is not a separate network that is has a gap between my life and their life, but I'm also part of it. I mean, somehow without knowing or unknowingly reinforce the same structure. So maybe understanding it, talking it through these social structures is really important. So that is why I feel like why when I saw the word heat futures and everything, decided to uh, join in for that thing, because to speculate better futures and more importantly describe the phenomena in better manner, so we can do better interventions if we describe something better, right? So that is what my idea is. What do you think, Anushka? Like, is the situation is same in India, or like?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. That's why I feel like talking about some of these things is so important, is because the more we talk about it, the more it enters public consciousness. The same has happened with heat. I feel like the last sort of decade in India is that it's entered the public consciousness, particularly in sort of traditionally hot regions, where of course it was already a part of how people were sort of going about their everyday in the summers. But I think we're thinking about this even beyond summertime and like some of these cooler areas, like cooler cities like Bangalore. Um, but I really sort of liked what you said about like these small micro moments of adaptation that we see tell us a lot about these big problems that often exist in reports, in some of our work that we're doing. And something that I find particularly interesting when we think of urban heat, and how it sort of like shapes modern day cities is there's a big sort of disconnect in like sort of modern city and sort of urban aesthetics, which are sort of leaning more towards high rises and like these glass buildings, which which are big trappers of heat. They generate a lot of emissions. They have huge sort of energy demands. But this is increasingly the sort of aesthetic that your modern day city is leaning in. And then sort of like these sort of hubs have large cooling demands that then affect parts of the city that already don't have enough sort of resources, adequate resources to adapt to the growing sort of like problems of heat. And also increasingly, I feel like some of these examples bring up thinking about who gets to stay cool in a city, and for whom discomfort is often normalized, for whom it's okay to sort of like adapt to heat, normalize heat, and who gets to sort of adapt using sort of external resources. who has the right to rest. Like you mentioned, productivity gets impacted in a huge way. And how we think about work needs to change. We need to sort of factor in regular rest, regular sort of breaks, particularly for people who are engaged in more labor-intensive work, whose body then ends up storing more heat than someone who's perhaps engaged in desk work. Which is then connected for me to the question of who has the right to leisure, which in a lot of like in at least in the context that I come from is a very gendered sort of question. So who is burdened with care work that comes with sort of like these rising temperatures and questions of heat stress, and who remains burdened with alongside these sort of care responsibilities also burdens of productivity, burdens of performance targets that we often see, for instance, when we talk about gig workers, the platform economy, and heat stress. So I feel like some of these questions, I know we've also answered in our interaction in the workshop, but I think remain important for us to sort of constantly pose to ourselves in the work that we're doing. And I would love to sort of hear from you on what you think of these, or if you want to add to this long list of perhaps questions, and then we'll eventually, towards the end of the conversation, perhaps think about some of these solutions.
And two things that stuck in my mind when you were talking, that is, one is about aesthetic and developments, which I like to talk a bit, and then something you mentioned about gender and everything, how adapt, who get to adapt and everything, recall a certain insight that I heard about how for instance, in Colombo, the public toilet infrastructure is not that really good if you, unless you go into a mall. Even though you have to pay like 20-40 rupees, like the space is not really clean, which ended up uh, female not drinking enough water because they have to ultimately use a washroom. So it is like a very layered understanding of how this infrastructure, gender aspect, everything working there. But at the same time, when you're talking about adaptations, like who get to preserve their lifestyle, like for instance, like um, we are working, and if the temperature is rising, we bring AC and fans and everything, try to preserve our normal routine without adapting into anything. And then whereas my previous example, if you talk, like if you look at it in a positive manner, uh, the person who brings out chair from a living room and work outside is, they're adapting their life. If we take it in a very speculative, question provoking manner, life could happen in that manner as well, because I'm not like romanticizing this life, but if you consider a traditional Sri Lankan vernacular house in let's say Knuckles area, everything, the old mud house, like they has a one unit which is sleeping, and every other activities are happening outside in a courtyard, sort of a covered area. So it's very adaptive, how to say, it's very functional and like very co-creating the space, and every time, instead of redefining space for like this is for living, this is for kitchen, and this is for so we could even use these adaptations in a positive manner to rethink how whoever try to preserve their normal lifestyle by adding more solutions, to rethink how we can live differently in this issue. And the second one is slightly linked to that, the first one, something you said, aesthetic and what it called development. So I remember like once you're doing a little bit of traveling for my studies, and I started to notice most of the capitals in the world started to look really same. Like you don't recognize whether you are in Colombo or Delhi or somewhere else, because all the building aesthetics, what we consider as development or how we should perceive an ideal house, ideal townscape, is really monotonous, and we think that okay, it should be very square, easy, then every aesthetics, then idea of uh, development is very unified in a manner. So what we are doing is like just trying to follow that line, assuming that that is the way to address this heat issue. That is what it means to preserve our lifestyle in this situation. But if you really look back, for instance, in Kathmandu, these Nevari houses are wooden houses that really suits for both the two different seasons in the city. So these kind of things actually what we I think we need to rethink and ask questions whether is this the aesthetic that we supposed to run after? Is this the is always like the approach of curing or try to fix, come up with new solutions that will allow us to remain in the same lifestyle? Is it the way to address? Are the few questions that I would like to add for your list.
I think very interesting what you said about Colombo and Bangalore in that way are very different sort of cities that have understood the question of heat in very different sort of ways. If someone were to write a book about the city, perhaps heat would feature very differently in these autobiographies of the two cities in different ways. Perhaps in Bangalore sort of like context, it would enter the life story of the city at a very sort of recent later stage. So perhaps we can think about some of those cultural differences that exist in how we've normalized heat in these two sort of contexts, how we speak about heat. And perhaps you can start with talking about Colombo.
Like when you said like you are getting ready for a summer, like in within our local vocabulary, like we don't have this summer winter term, right? So we never refer to it that manner. Either it's raining or it's sunny, and only we are really familiar about the monsoon season. So we expect that, and the rest of the year is sunny, and it is quite normal to be sunny and little bit extra hot, and we are in that manner mentally prepared to experience high heat during April because it's associated with this New Year and everything. The sun is getting perpendicular to the island and everything. And heat is more often like not a new issue in that sense, rather a very casual entering point for a small chat. You get into a tuk-tuk, it's a starting point. It's really hot today, and we will casually mention about it and then move into complain about politics and everything. So that is like, I think, a different, even like if you consider it to bring a dialogue around heat is difficult because it's already part of it. Like why you're complaining about it, like we have been living with it for so long. And yes, it's really difficult now. Can we do it anything? Like those kind of cultural questions may arise within certain communities because uh, it's not that, for instance, if all of a sudden the temperature drops, then it's an issue. For instance, I remember like one time there was a El Nino passing by Sri Lanka, and we were experiencing a temperature around 28 degrees, 27 degrees for 5 days. And we started to wear sweaters, and like alcohol consumption was slightly got higher, and people were complaining, and they now started to talk about, okay, something happening with the globe, that's why we are experiencing these things. So yeah, in that sense, like culturally, heat is even considered as like a difficulty, but that we simply mitigate it by giving like serving people and discussing it. For instance, uh, if you look at cultural evolution, like we have this practice called Ping Thalia, which is a free sort of a water pot that you keep outside your house or shops, everything, so whoever passing by could drink from it. So in that sense, like heat is always work as a part of our life, and there are different small interventions to help whether humans or non more than human entities. So in that sense, yes, like going into deep uh, discussions around it in global level or climate level aspects, it's quite, I would say, like culturally our language or the sentences doesn't afford that complexity in that sense because it has been a part of very casual, but casual, but still we are acknowledging the difficulties in a human to human, human to animal interaction level.
I think that's very interesting because I would say Bangalore is perhaps on the other end of this conversation where heat hasn't been something that you would associate necessarily with Bangalore. When you think of, because India is a sort of nation where, like you said, there's no onset of summer. It's perpetual summer that's interrupted with sort of, little sort of like winters, perhaps up in the north, particularly in sort of desert regions like Rajasthan, which sort of experience extreme weathers in both sort of capacities. If you go to sort of more humid, rainy regions, then perhaps summers or like heat is clubbed with sort of humidity, etc. So a few sort of cities that you would come to your mind when you would think of, okay, this city in the country has pleasant to sort of like moderately cool weather. You'd think of a Pune, you'd think of a Bangalore, apart from, of course, up north in the hills. But increasingly, I feel like that's changing for the city. I'd say even in um, my sort of first interaction with the city, this was I visited Bangalore for the first time in 2017, and I remember thinking because I was coming from Jaipur, I remember thinking, okay, this is a lovely city because it's pleasant, it's cool, much different from sort of like the hot summers of Rajasthan. But recently, I think when I visited Bangalore, that was not the case. You could no longer sort of rely on perhaps just the city being naturally cool. You would have to sort of, um, and again, for those of us who can afford to sort of have these appliances aid to sort of like rising heat stress, your ACs, fans, etc. So I think it's interesting also to think about what happens to uh, how does this shape conversations around heat in a city like this? Because I think a lot of times then, because heat isn't sort of um, isn't a conversation that's naturally integrated in the history of the city. Perhaps a lot of times conversations might look like, oh, it's getting hot like Delhi in Bangalore, or it's getting hot like it is in Chennai. So I feel like a lot of conversation happens perhaps in comparatives, happens with references that lie outside of the city. And I'm not sure how well, for instance, even something like heat travels across cities. Even within cities, I feel like heat is layered, heat is sort of differential in across pockets of the city, even in sort of so-called cooler regions within central Delhi. There are pockets that experience a lot of heat, are sort of under a lot of duress that way. So what happens then to sort of innovations also, creative ways that might already exist in a culture that is used to heat, like for instance, like you mentioned, a Colombo, or where I grew up, a Jaipur, or where I am right now, a Delhi, where heat is like a sort of part of the common parlance. We're sort of talking about weather in a small talk fashion, but also in a this affects our daily lives. This affects how we move across the city, um, which might not be the case for a Bangalore. And so then perhaps questions of planning, perhaps questions of adaptation need to be thought about more seriously for a people who are not used to heat being sort of like a feature of their life in such a major way. And also thinking about language and linguistics, right? I think you mentioned sort of like practices in Colombo. I can sort of think back to my childhood in sort of northern India and like move beyond these Western vocabularies of, say, heat stress, or not Western, perhaps these sort of vocabularies that exist in English, but like regional vocabularies around these things, and like I think what those look like. I think that is also perhaps an interesting thing to examine for cities like Bangalore, where this is a more sort of like nascent question.
I think I mentioned that during the climate change, the workshop as well, um, which is the siesta practice in Mediterranean countries. So during their long heat days, they as a country realize, okay, we don't have to try to work in this heat sunny day, like let's sleep after the meal. So it's a nice cultural ritualistic approach, like telling that, okay, don't disturb me. And we are as a nation, not as an individual, like I'm not ready to work, but as a culturally country, let's not work, because at the end of the day, all these deadlines and everything what we create as urgents are the construction of us. And if it is there are higher uh, pressures and higher environmental practices, we don't have to continue as we used to do it in other time. So how we could deal with spaces and indoors as a society, have that option as well, whereas instead trying to continuously solve the problem or intervene it in a like try to come up with very technocratic solutions.
I think that's very interesting. Because like you said, I think there's a couple of buzzwords I feel like in when we talk about climate. A big one I think for me that I hear at every sort of conference, every workshop, any room that you enter is innovation, or like behavioral sort of like nudges. And I feel like there's many sort of like cultural ways in which like climate is changing just simply like how our bodily rhythms also like function. It's reshaping how culture is imagined within communities, within cities. That is not featured as a part of like this conversation. When I think like heat is is so often sort of like treated as simply the business of staying cool. When there's more to that. Um, and I think like in that context for me it's also a couple of things that are really interesting is what happens also to like memories of childhood, because I remember a big part of like my childhood was summer breaks. And summer breaks typically in India happen, at least in like northern India, happen around the months of May to June, also because these are sort of like typically hotter times of the year. It is hot in some capacity across the year, but these are sort of like typically identified as hotter months in your calendar. So summer vacations were a big sort of like big moments of leisures. They were a big part, I think, of my sort of like cherished memories of my childhood. But then what happens to some of these memories as going outside and playing in some of these months becomes intolerable for children? What happens to learning outcomes of children, particularly in from lower income households, who are going to sort of schools that are perhaps sort of like makeshift spaces with like tin sheds, and they're sort of like studying already in circumstances where, for instance, in some of these schools there's one teacher who's teaching kids across sort of like various sort of like moments in their learning journeys. So like there's different levels that way. They're tackling sort of resource crunches in that aspect, but also don't have adequate ways to sort of cool these learning spaces. And then what can we really say about learning outcomes of a child that's studying in sort of like duress because of rising temperatures, because of heat? And I think also of like public spaces, I feel like in general, because for instance, streets, you mentioned about how a lot of like life moved from, say, living rooms to streets. And I feel like that streets are so important culturally in South Asia. They're not just sort of like our ways of getting from point A to point B, but there's a lot of like cultural sort of like life happening at streets. Um, there's your night markets that happen in like different cities. There's different memories that we associate to these. So then what happens when like it's you know a big part of like sort of the message around this is just pushing cultural life inside. It's really hot outside. if you can't bear the heat, so just like go to a mall to cool off. And who really belongs then in like these sort of like commercial spaces? Because the identity of, say, a person who exists in a mall is that of a buyer, is that of a consumer. So then who is a sort of rightfully sort of belonging person in that kind of a space is also a question. And then sort of larger questions also of how are we imagining adaptation in our cities? Are we imagining it in a way that that's telling people to sort of escape heat at an individual level, what we've been sort of talking about? But are we reshaping or redesigning cities in general, shared spaces collectively? Are we adding to more shade? Are we cool roofs are sort of like a great way perhaps to think about solutions, water access to what you mentioned earlier, sort of sanitation facilities that are safe and hygienic, so that women can also sort of access some of these spaces. Um, because that will really sort of like define, I feel like, just how we move across cities in general, and how we sort of normative questions, I feel like, of how we imagine a city. Are we imagining a sort of if we're privatizing some of these like moments of, I feel like, dealing with heat stress, is the sort of message really to sort of sort of take it inside. It's all right if heat pushes sort of people inside, even if it means for a lonelier, perhaps more individualized experience of the city, on top of some of the inequalities that already exist across cities and like lived experiences. Um, but I feel like we've added a lot to like a long list of questions that can perhaps be answered. And it might be interesting then to reflect, I think, from our experiences and interactions and engagements at the workshop, on finding some solutions to these questions. But also, I think, from some of the work that we've done individually, and solutions that we might have come across that looked interesting. Um, yeah, because I feel like you said, while it's important to, I think, ask the right questions, perhaps what also gives us hope is to look at interesting solutions that are perhaps changing the landscape and talking about innovative ways in which we can think about this problem.
Yeah, like I think that is where imagining futures or alternative futures really comes in handy, because it gives the freedom of, like, you are not trying to predict the future, but you see the flexibility of future and think of not naturally inevitable future, but rather preferred desired futures. So, but that very exercise gives the same issue of like how to change our underlying assumption that we continue to discuss here today. Like, for instance, what it means to uh, intervene with heat beyond fixing it in an individual level without changing anything in our life, or what it means to have a city in this context. Because I remember, like, the first few 2 to 3 iterations we did in the at the workshop, even though this sounds very futuristic, the underlying assumptions remain same. Like, we were thinking in same economic terms, we were thinking in same behavioral terms. So in that case, like, understanding those, like, to better coming up with solutions, understanding those underlying assumptions is also really important to come up with vernacular solutions and everything. Because we continuously try to, talk about the decolonial aspect of development, aesthetics, and everything, even today. And it is really an important thing. Like, when you try to solve the problem, you need to look upon, like, where this value is coming from. Like, I will give a nice example that I observed in one of our rural villages. So for one of my researches, I continuously go to this isolated village. It's within a rainforest. You have to walk in 6 kilometers within the jungle to reach that village. So they have a very sustainable vernacular way of doing architecture, and roof with dried tree leaves and everything, and half walls. So during late 90s, early 2000, the village was exposed to the broader media, and people started to go there with the intention of really helping. There is a school there, and the first intervention they did was they changed the dried leaf to sheets, asbestos sheets, which during the high winter season it blow away. So they changed the half wall into a full wall, assuming that it is the right classroom to have, the developed classroom to give, and which worsened the situation by increasing the Bernoulli pressure. And then as a solution, what they did was like they put hard steel frames to hold the roof. So one by one, they were adding more and more complexity, which started to like invade the vernacular sustainable system into a very different one, which they start required for more power, solar power, everything. So because I wouldn't say anyone who these charity organizations, even university students who did with a noble purpose, but only thing was like in there is a underlying idea of like I could like a Prometheus complex, I could solve it. You know, those kind of like individually, it's in a way naive, but again like not acknowledging the complexity of it. So that is where I like to emphasize on like the idea of like solution. Even as a word itself, I'm afraid to the word solution because it hints that you have understood the problem. In our case, I believe like we don't. We are dealing with a agnostically big entity. It is even in a manner flattening the complexity when we use the term system. It's a good term compared to what we had earlier. But the moment you use the word system, it implies that, okay, there are certain parts, there are, like wheels, there are purposes, everything. Somehow you could understand. But for me, whatever the, like planet, all these entities are agnostically big, which is cannot be understood. All we can do is try to trace the complexity, all the entanglement, which makes you in a manner cautious when you want to intervene. Like you will not come up with solutions, but rather you try to intervene in a cautious manner, knowing that it could take any different turn. That is where I when it comes to heat or any complex issue, what I try to discuss or have a chat is that okay, maybe slow down in the process of understanding the complexity, spending more time than the action. Like
I think it's very interesting what you said about solutions, and also particularly about systems. Because while it's an interesting sort of lens that allows us to move from a very individualistic sort of way of thinking about how to deal with some of the contemporary, perhaps an interesting word that I came across to think about these things is wicked problems of our times. But it also assumes that there is a system, a well-functioning system in place, when what often exists on the ground is various broken chains, and sort of like um, different parts that not often make a whole system. And part of the problem is to have that sort of whole system in place so that there's identified pathways, but perhaps we're not there yet. And another sort of interesting thing that I thought came up in the example that you mentioned was, while some of this work that happens is, of course, well intentioned, if it does not take into account indigenous sort of, and I will perhaps use the word solutions again, because there's not one that comes to my mind that's better. But these indigenous solutions, or like these indigenous knowledge systems that already exist and that have thought about some of these questions of heat, and that are, of course, perhaps also adapting to the current sort of form that this problem has taken. But I feel like our our planning, our sort of heat action plans that exist in India have to account for like some of these on-ground realities, some of these people who are already sort of shaping their ways of like dealing with heat. Planning for me also has to go beyond just thinking of heat as a climate problem, or increasingly I think we're okay with thinking of it as a health problem. But there's many sort of intersecting questions of, say, housing, of labor rights, of class, caste, gender, that we've already sort of spoken about. I think there's interesting sort of examples of that have already happened in India. So, for instance, in the city of Ahmedabad in 2013, they came out with their heat action plan, and that identifies, in a very interesting way, how women can be sort of drivers of climate adaptation. So they worked with this organization called Mahila Housing Trust to upskill women in sort of um, painting with like solar reflective paint, in working with insulated ceilings, modular roofs. So it did that double pronged work of doing climate adaptation, adapting the city to sort of heat, but also upskilling women and involving women in some of these conversations that we're having about building climate responsive solutions, to these questions of heat, etc., in our cities. So I feel like there are these like tiny pockets of hope that already exist that we can borrow from. And I think in general, as a rule of thumb, I think it's good to go back to perhaps some of the questions that we listed. Um, it also sort of helps us think about who are we missing when we're talking about these questions. And I think that brings us to perhaps the last bit of what has been a very interesting conversation, I think, for me. And I think perhaps an interesting place to end at would be to reflect on how the workshop allowed us to build um, some of these interventions, interjections in this long sort of trajectory of conversations around heat. We got to build our own prototypes, which is, I think, a rare thing in workshops. Mostly workshops involve a lot of thinking, and like people come and say often the same things that they've been saying about the climate crisis. But I think what was unique about the Heat Futures project was that it really allowed us to think and reflect, but also to put that thinking into action, and build our own sort of prototypes. And perhaps, Dilna, you can talk about the prototype that you built at the Colombo workshop with your team.
Yeah, like I think we naturally flow into the idea of like important of questioning the current situation with better futures. And in that particular aspect, when it comes to the workshop, we had this specific area of care and the heat. So it was focus more on like people, especially female, who are doing a lot of care work under this heat situation where it is not formally recognized as work or get paid for this work. So we discuss how it works and how this the patriarchic aspect of economic system work and everything. What we came up was a care-based currency. So it's the name is Kai, and we try to build up uh, a currency name, how the currency works, the formula works, how a community should work on based on that currency. So it's basically a currency design, how it transferred and everything. So the prototype had these currency symbol and everything. We were rethinking everything. And one of interesting thing that we rethought, I would say, what we come up with was like right now in this way of we thinking about wealth and everything, we count them individually. So your net worth is like that, blah blah blah. And what we try to do was like we try to come up with a community wealth. So instead of individual wealth, the community get to claim this is our net worth. So based on how much care work you are exchanging, how much of work you are connected and doing to recognize this work, and and that work itself work as a way to sustain the community. That is the basic approach that we did. In one sense, it gives the question of whether it's really possible to quantify the care work, and it opened a lot of interesting questions, which is again I think a part of speculative design. You come up with better questions, but at the same time the very idea of like thinking the wealth beyond individual to a community, it's really interesting, and to think like that and recognize that, because I was really hyped, and the tab about the currency was continuously worked when I returned home, because I have come to my mother's place at that day, and I try to apply the equation to my family there. And my mother is the like has the most connections, because like she was telling that my next day neighbor auntie had a cataract surgery. She was giving her food for the lunch, so which in our currency it count as like a connection. We don't count, like we don't try to give the value to individual actions, but we count in zeros and ones. So my mother has care connection to that auntie, myself, like that. So in that case, like the community wealth increased. And the other important thing, like the moment she came, she was just casually telling that, okay, uh, today we had a power cut. So all of a sudden I realized all the lunch she had prepared, everything was done on the extra heat, and it's not the same that we did. So I think all by focusing on these things, I get to recognize, okay, what it means a care work in this situation, how we should recognize, etc. So I think our prototype, like provoke more questions, and even it spread into our department, and we try to like do certain implementation on that as same thought of line as well. So I'm just curious what you did in there, Bangalore.
So our prototype was a board game that would give its players a snapshot of how heat is managed and experienced by different people from different walks of life, people who are engaged in different kinds of work in Bangalore. So this essentially was an aim to sort of use storytelling to show how heat is not a monolithic question, how heat is experienced differently by different people depending on what they do. Um, if they're engaged in a more labor intensive job, their body will also store heat differently. Heat is spread across different parts of the city in a different way. It's not all the same, like you can't just take a look at like the temperature in Bangalore today and decide, okay, this is how hot it is in the city. Like you said earlier, it's a lived experience, and a lot of times some of these indexes and like some of these scientific ways to sort of perhaps think about heat don't allow that complexity to sort of really fit in. So we thought to gamify it, we thought to sort of think of it like a board game where you would essentially have different different players. So yeah, essentially players would have um, different sort of like cards, action cards that would be sort of reflect scenarios. They could be challenges. This could look like sort of long hours under the sun working. This could look like sort of perhaps choosing between taking public transport or taking your sort of like individual vehicle. So this would also help you think about how individual choices affect the larger ecosystem. If I choose to take a car to work today, what sort of repercussions in terms of sort of emissions does that have for the city? And then how is it connected to how hot or cool the city is then? An interesting element that perhaps is a connecting sort of thread across the two prototypes is that you can only, all the players could only continue to play the game as long as everyone remains in the game. So even if one person has finished up their sort of like cooling coins or their cool currency, then that's game over for everyone. So then that also sort of like nudges people to think about how we can think of these questions at the community level and not just thinking about how comfortable am I, how cool am I, And how can I sort of individually deal with this question of heat, but how can we also make collective choices that affect the cities that we live in. So I think that was the place that we were coming from. We wanted to sort of make it a fun conversation that would then allow people to sort of also interact with the lived experience of heat, and also bring in that sort of collective and community action.
No, that is really good. Like it's a nice one. I think I feel like ideologically it share a lot of affinities, right? The importance of working in the collective currency, and I love that twist. Like when the game is forcing you to consider about the collective achievement of goals. That's really nice.
Cool. I think some interesting things have come out of the two workshops that happened and like out of this program. And I think I'm very excited personally to see like where you take your prototype. And I will keep sort of like my eyes peeled if you and your team ever put something out. But perhaps as we close this, it would be interesting to also maybe pin one key thought that sort of sticked with you throughout this conversation and like throughout your work on this, that you would like also for the audience to take away from this.
Yeah, it's really a good conversation, and it was really good to hear about your prototype as well. Maybe if you get a chance, we could play it one day, like maybe bring it to a Good Life Hub, right? And I feel like if we look at the today's conversation or a workshop itself, it was continuously there's a thread that keep coming up, which is critically looking to our assumptions and how we try to understand this. For me, that is one of key takeaway for myself. That is what speculating futures gives us. Like if you want to really speculate the same problems in the same manner, there's no point of having a good imagination. So you could go free, which the very point of questioning what we have taken granted or what we have taken as right, it's an opportunity to critically look into that. I think that is one of my key takeaways, and that is what I would like others to consider, like uh, to critically question how you understand things about environment, ecology, everything, and how you try to describe it. All these things have more opportunities to critically think, look back, slow down before you try to, act upon it.
Lovely. I think mine is also a sort of in a connected vein, um, in that I think we have to begin by perhaps taking pen to paper and making that long list of questions that are really important for us to um, ground our research, ground our work, be it in the on the policy front or be it with communities on the ground. So, like you said, like take that critical lens and sort of keep it steady in your work. Think about some of these questions of like that we often assume, have assumptions about some of these normative questions of like who who has the right to stay cool, who gets the right to rest in a changing world, in a world where like heat is so deeply informing the future of our work. We talk about AI all the time, but how do some of these questions redefine how we look at work, how we look at leisure? And then also to, I think, continue to think of heat not just as a scientific problem, not just as a problem that has maybe certain sort of like numbers or temperatures attached to it, but as a lived experience that is not uniform across the board, that is not uniform even in one city. So I think perhaps also to take what we've said today, what we've shared as with a pinch of salt. These are our sort of experiences that have come up in the particularities of our work, and there's more to this story on heat. So to read up more and to engage with perhaps some of the solutions that communities on the ground are building. It has been a lovely conversation with you, Dilna, and I'm very grateful to Good Life X and to Lagori Collective for putting us in this shared space so that we could learn from these different contexts of Colombo and Bangalore, because I think the only way to like do some of this work to tackle this sort of like wicked problem of climate change is to do it together, is to do it collaboratively. So I'm very glad to have learned a lot from you.
Likewise, it's really similar. Like I really enjoy to hear your thoughts and all these insightful inputs, and it's running on my head. Probably I will think about them right after as well. So once again, thank you, Anushka, and good life, Emma, and everybody to giving me this opportunity.
You got me living a good life. Oh, we're putting up a good fight. It's like we're soaking up the sunlight.